It seems another day, another Canadian mayor under fire for conflict of interest or breaking the law. Is this a sign that corruption is more pervasive in Canadian politics than previously believed? Joining us to help answer that question in Columbus, Ohio via Skype, Guy Giorno, partner at Fasken Martineau. And joining us here in studio, Don Jack is a partner at Airden Burles LLP. Tom Marshall, director at Transparency International Canada, and Ian Green, professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration at York University. We want to remind you, you can be part of this conversation. Our producers Hillary Clark and Daniel Kitts are hosting a Twitter chat right now. Chime in and let us know your thoughts on tonight's topic, and you can use the hashtag AgendaTVO. And with that, welcome to everybody, both here in the studio and Guy, to you on the line via Skype. Let me start with you, Guy, because it's pretty tough these days to open a newspaper in this country without reading about some mayor in some place that's in trouble for some reason. I wonder whether we have a bigger corruption problem in this country than we had previously thought. What's your view?
Well, a couple of comments. First is we have to distinguish between corruption and conflict of interest. I mean, both are bad, but there are different degrees of badness, and I don't think it's appropriate to compare what's happening in London necessarily to what's happening in Toronto. That being said, it's been said that a few bad apples spoil the bunch, and in every jurisdiction of Canada, it seems that we do have politicians that from time to time stray over the lines. And yes, it is a problem. The real question is whether the laws and processes we have are the right laws, the proper processes to deal with those problems when they come up.
We'll get to that in a second, but let me ask you to sort of take your legal hat off for a second and put on the hat that you used to wear. You once were Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Harper, same job, I think, for former Premier Mike Harris. You have a lot of experience in political circles. Does it seem to you, based on your experience, that we have a big problem with this in Canada?
I wouldn't say we have a big problem with it. I would say that these issues arise, though, when we can't blind ourselves to the fact that from time to time politicians step over the line. It's not a pervasive problem, but on the other hand, it's not an entirely absent problem. It keeps happening with frequency, and that suggests that it's an issue to be dealt with.
Okay, Tom Marshall, to you next. Just today, your organization, Transparency International Canada, released its Corruption Perceptions Index. And apparently Canada ranked 9th, which is not the best, but it's better than the UK, France, the United States, and Germany. So what do you think that says about us?
Well, I think what it says about us is that, relatively speaking, that is compared with the other countries that are the subject of the CPI, Canada fares very well. It is not an indication in absolute terms that Canada is free of corruption or that there are no continuing issues here. It would be a mistake, I think, for Canada and Canadians to become complacent about the issue of corruption in this country.
Who was number one?
Number one, I think, was Norway.
Oh.
The Scandinavian countries.
They're always number one in everything,
rank,
aren't they?
rank better. The United States was 24.
So we're well ahead of the United States. Ian, okay, so we're better than the Americans, we're better than the Russians, we're better than the Chinese, but we're not number one. Where do you think we are on this?
Well, it's interesting that Norway is number one because Norway also has the best civics education program amongst developed countries in the world. And so I think there's a greater understanding of the importance of the ethics rules, of interpersonal respect, the importance of avoiding corruption in Norway than there is in Canada. The United States, I think, has the worst civics education record, and so that explains that they're further down in the list, I think. So really, I think education is the key to certainly to tackling conflict of interest. That's what we've been using in Canada in terms of the ethics commissioners that we have now in every jurisdiction, federally and provincially. But it's also key in the general public. We need to educate people about what is, what are the basic rules of conflict of interest, but also what is corruption. And as citizens, we have a responsibility to report corruption when we see it. And what amazes me in Quebec, if we leave the municipalities for a while, or leave Ontario for a while, what amazes me is that the whistle wasn't blown a lot sooner with the things that are happening there.
Indeed. Well, Don, maybe I can get you to follow up on that insofar as not to cast any doubt on the index that Tom has out, but if a lot of this is happening in the shadows, away from prying eyes, how do we even know how big the problem is?
Well, the short answer is we do not. Tom can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I think Canada has ranked 9th or 10th for a number of years on that scale, which indicates to me that there has been and remains room for improvement. And coming to a point that was made about civics, I think the most recent conflict of interest cases which have come up in Ontario have indicated that the public doesn't necessarily understand the importance of, for example, the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act.
They just look at it as it's all corruption and they're going to brush it all with one brush.
Or they regard it as something that shouldn't have caused such a fuss in the first place, and don't seem to appreciate that the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, I'm just using that as an example, serves a purpose, has been thought out, was there for years, and it indeed was necessitated by previous problems which arose. So it's best to keep that history in mind, in my view.
But I think that the codes of conduct are important. But I think they are honored in the disregard that they have received over the years, that there's often a pervasive sense of entitlement that elected officials have, that rules are not made for them, they're made for others. There's a laxity, and echoing what Ian was saying, is education, civics understanding is important, that there is a need for cultural change.
Well, before we get too far down this cultural road, let's make sure that we're clear that we understand what we're talking about, because as I think we just suggested here, the public may just regard it all as the same thing. So Guy, come on in here and talk to us about the continuum where we talk about, on the one hand, you know, taking garbage bags full of cash out behind a restaurant, to somebody may have run afoul of one subsection of the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. I mean, there are varying degrees of malfeasance here, presumably, right?
Yeah, and this was a couple of years ago really spelled out by the Federal Court of Appeal in a case called Democracy Watch in Campbell, where they pointed out that on the one hand, first of all, everybody in government has private interests. You know, your financial benefits of private interest, your spouse, your friends, they create private interests, and then you've got public duties. And the way the court saw it, when you willingly choose or knowingly choose to subordinate your duty to the public in favor of a private interest, be it your own or your spouse's or close friends or whatever, you're actually being corrupt. But we don't think that that's the only standard that ought to apply to politicians. We try to, and government officials, we hope that government officials and politicians are never put in the position of choosing between their public duty, the public good, and their private interest. And when those two intersect, regardless of whether a government official chooses rightly or chooses wisely, he or she is considered to be in a conflict of interest. And we've got laws and codes in place that say, you know, we're not going to let you choose, we're not going to let you decide, we're not going to let you vote in those situations. It's not enough to say you've preferred your public duty. The issue is that when those two intersect or come into contact, you've got to back off, and that's what we define as a conflict of interest, an apparent conflict of interest. That's a shorthand way of describing the continuum.
Okay, but
you're corrupt when you prefer a private interest to your public duty. You're in a conflict when you have the chance to choose. So
let's just take down two very prominent examples in the news today.
Yes.
Okay, we see what's going on in the province of Quebec right now.
Yes.
I guess most people would call a lot of that corruption, as opposed to what Rob Ford, the Mayor of Toronto, has been involved in, $3,150 running afoul of the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act.
There's a vast difference.
There is a vast difference.
Yes.
Do you think people appreciate that, or do they just say, oh, they're all a bunch of thieves?
No, I think people appreciate it, but I think at the same time, and I don't want to be repeating what I said earlier, that they don't understand that even a $3,100 issue can be important. It can be important if, and this gets back to what Guy was saying a moment ago, if there's been a deliberate disregard of the rules, which are there for a good reason.
In which case, Ian, let me go to the other side of it, which is, can there be an over-appreciation of the difference between these things, meaning what's going on in Quebec is corruption. What the Mayor of Toronto did, please don't waste my time with it, it's nothing.
Well, I wouldn't call what Rob Ford has done as corruption, because corruption to me is criminal fraud. So that's where you're deliberately dishonest in order to get money for yourself. And the more money, the more fraudulent it is. What Rob Ford has done is clearly a breach of the conflict of interest rules, that, and because he has deliberately breached them on a number of occasions, he had several chances to apologize and to do the right thing, and he refused to do so because the rules weren't for him. That could be symptomatic of more important ethics issues that he could get involved in the future. And that's why this small issue is important, because if you can't follow the small rules and you deliberately don't abide by them over and over again, then you may get involved in more serious issues that could be corruption.
Let me follow up with Guy on this one. You've worked in the Prime Minister's office, you've worked in a Premier's office, and you've certainly had a keen eye with what's going on in municipalities across Ontario. Can you come to any conclusion about which level of government is more or less likely to get into more or less trouble on these kinds of things?
No, I think that anybody who's got a public duty stands the risk of running afoul of the rules. So I don't think that any level of government is more likely to be conflicted or more likely to be corrupt. I will say this, though, that at all levels, problems emerge in two ways. First of all, when politicians are given the ability to enforce these laws, we've seen this experience federally, provincially, at a municipal level. When the politicians are the ultimate enforcers of the law, they act in a political or partisan way, and this is the case for having third parties make these determinations. And the second thing we learn is that it's so important at all levels for the public to have the transparency tools they need, whether it's freedom of information or lobbyist disclosure. I mean, we're never going to know everything that goes on, but every single data point, every single piece of information the news media, the public have, and this is true of every level of government, helps them to expose these things and hold our politicians accountable.
Don, how would you answer that question about whether one level of government is more likely to get involved in this than another?
No, I agree with Guy. There's no point saying it's more likely to be the federal, the provincial, or municipal governments. If you were talking about actual corruption, I'd draw the distinction between that and, for example, breaches of ethical codes, which may be much more serious but still have to be dealt with. If you're talking about actual corruption, it tends to happen where the money is spent. So in the federal government, it wouldn't happen in the finance department, but it might happen in a department where they're actually spending the money that the finance department allots to them.
Hello, Public Works?
Not going to
You're not going there.
any particular departments, but the practicality of it is where the money is spent, that often is the place where the problem lies.
But one of the important aspects of this discussion, I think, is the attitude that the general public has towards the conduct of public officials, whether they're municipal, provincial, or federal, that it is a question of confidence and trust that we, and I'll say collectively, all of us who are electors and so on, and participants in this democratic process, want to have in those who are there to make decisions notionally on our behalf. And to the extent that conduct disturbs that sense of trust and so on, the system can be seen to be problematic. And as Guy says, there are independent institutions, integrity commissioners, ombudsmen, there are public auditors, auditors general, there are lobbyist registrars.
Okay, hold off on that because we're going to get to all that stuff in a second.
But who are in place to provide guidance and direction with respect to this conduct issue.
Okay, let me follow up with this because as we watch what goes on in the province of Quebec, there may be a tendency by people here in the province of Ontario to feel somewhat smug, saying, oh boy, there's Quebec living up to all the worst stereotypes we think about it. However, get comfortable, everybody. I've got a bit of a list here. The MFP inquiry didn't take place all that long ago in the city of Toronto. Mayor Rob Ford's conflict of interest issue is now before the courts. Hazel McCallion, the mayor of Mississauga, had an issue related to a development and her son. This time, and I think about 25 years ago, she was involved in another conflict of interest situation when she was the mayor of Streetsville. Harinder Thakkar is seeking the leadership of the Ontario Liberals right now. He was found to be in a conflict of interest, trying to deal with his personal family business while it was supposedly in a blind trust, and he was a cabinet minister at the time. Question, Guy, can we really be all that smug about this here in the province of Ontario?
I don't think we should be smug about this in the province of Ontario. It can happen anywhere, and it does happen anywhere, not just in Ontario and Quebec, but in other provinces as well, and at all levels. Absolutely not. And as much as we might point to some things in Quebec, it's actually true that in many respects, Quebec has stronger rules and more enforcement of various ethical codes than Ontario does, and certainly than the federal government does. So they are, while they're dealing with certain challenges right now in terms of legal framework and legal enforcement, they are national leaders in accountability and ethics.
Although Ontario, I think, was the first person to put in an ethics commissioner, right? This is going back to the late 1980s?
Provincially.
Yes.
Provincially.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And it was only a year ago that Quebec put into place a similar type of ethics commissioner, though they had a different sort that was in effect in 2002. But I agree with Guy that I've looked at the ethics scandals across Canada, federally, provincially, and municipally.
Who's the juiciest?
And
Come on.
well, it changes from period to period. I mean, during Gomery, it was the federal government that was the worst, and Oliphant, but we had a series of ethics scandals in Ontario in the late 1980s. And Alberta has had some pretty serious scandals too, currently and then in the past. So it depends from one period to another. But my impression is, and this is just an impression, that there are more scandals at the municipal level than the provincial or federal level. And this is because there are more municipalities. There are tens of thousands across the country.
Right.
Most municipal politicians are extremely honest, but there's more of a chance for municipal politicians to get into trouble. And municipally in Ontario, we only have, I think, we have fewer than 20 independent ethics commissioners in the municipalities, and thousands of municipalities. So, education is the key to preventing conflicts of interest and corruption.
And if I go back, I think maybe it's 20, 25 years now, I mean, the Conservative Party of Saskatchewan doesn't exist anymore.
You're right.
Because people went to jail.
Exactly.
They were hip deep in the corruption there.
Extremely good example.
Yeah, so one of the senators went to jail. All right, well, let's try this.
It can happen anywhere, Steve,
Yeah.
as Guy points out. And if we're talking about the province of Quebec, the other side of the coin is that they're very, very serious about getting to the bottom of what's happening, and that's clear from the Charbonneau Commission. Indeed, there are complaints about the Charbonneau Commission being too zealous and sweeping up too many people in it.
But let me also add that with respect to Quebec, the question is whether or not matters were so secret there, or whether indeed there were a lot of people in the know and had been for a very long time. And that'll be one of the questions the Charbonneau Commission is going to have to deal with.
You think the latter?
Why? Yes. Why did these matters not become matters of public interest before now?
Because it was in no one's interest except the public's to have them come out.
Perhaps.
Did I say that out loud? Okay. Guy, try this for me. After the Oliphant inquiry, after the Gomery inquiry, the Bellamy inquiry, which was MFP, and even you could say e-health as well, people might come to the conclusion that we're kind of figuring this out, that we're getting a handle on this stuff, and yet we're seeing a rash of allegations lately. Why do you think?
Well, I think a couple of things. First of all, when we have rules and codes are relatively new and increasing, the more codes you have, the more likely you are to have infractions. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. It means that there are standards that are being identified and observed. And I also believe that the more transparency we have, the more lobbyists disclose their dealings, the more freedom of information, which is now more than 25 years old in Ontario, is working, the more the citizens and the news media, which are surrogates for citizenry, have the tools to hold government to account. So, we will hopefully reach a stage where we hear and read about these less and less in the news. But I think the fact that we're noticing actual scandals or alleged scandals is proof that the system's working, the tools are there, and people are being more vigilant. It's short-term bad thing, but in a long-term kind of way, it's actually good that we're more attuned to these problems.
Well, let me follow up with Ian on that, because I do remember covering Queen's Park in the late 1980s when I think David Peterson's government lost something like 8 ministers because they didn't meet the new, stricter code of conduct that he had put in place, and as a result, he was accepting a lot of resignations during the course of his 5 years as Premier. His zealousness to put in a higher standard and create the first ethics commissioner in the country ultimately ended up making his government look like there was a stink around it, like it was somehow mired in corruption. Yeah. This is a double-edged sword, isn't it?
And that was to begin with, but since that time, On average, there have been serious allegations of conflict of interest with regard to cabinet ministers in Ontario once every couple of years. And in most cases, the investigation finds that they haven't violated the rules, or they haven't violated them in a serious way. So the system is working. But you're right, after the new system is put into place, often there is a spike to begin with. So governments have to be prepared to weather that. But across the country, when these regimes are put into place, in the end, there were many fewer conflicts of interest. This will be the case in the municipalities too, I'm convinced, once more municipalities put these into effect, once they have the courage to do so. But they always resist to begin with, because they think, gee, that means the rules are in place where there's a greater chance that we'll break the rules that are in place. They have to think into the longer run, and the longer run doesn't need to be more than 1 or 2 years.
Right. Tom, you referred to a bit of a list a while ago, ethics commissioners, integrity commissioners. We're seeing a lot of them across the country right now, and obviously they've been introduced to deal with previous scandalous situations that government of the day felt a need to clean up. Do you think these accountability measures are working?
Absolutely. I think it takes time. I think it takes time to build trust, not only in the public that they are performing a useful function, but also in the governments where they operate, building trust among the elected officials and bureaucrats in the effectiveness of these institutions as places where you can raise issues, where you can discuss matters, where you can get clarification about things. And part of their role, ethics commissioners and ombudsmen and so on, is educational. And much of that is being done across the country. I think it is perhaps important to look at what is happening in Canada as part of the development of a national integrity network. And it's not just these institutions that are being created that form a kind of, hopefully ultimately a coordinated kind of approach to the development of best practices across the country, but also to link up with the fact that media is vigilant, that there are the police and other investigative agencies that are there, and together they can deal with almost any issue that arises.
Well,
but it does depend on those who know to tell.
Sure. Let me follow up with Guy on this, because your former boss, Stephen Harper, when he was leader of the opposition, used to give ethics commissioners and integrity commissioners, I'm sure, a lot of heartburn, because he constantly went after them, saying that they were lapdogs to the Prime Minister of the day and not really doing their job. So are these institutional positions really as effective as Tom suggested they were?
Well, they're very effective, but they depend in part on the legislation that creates them. And I'll add, the reason I'm in Columbus, Ohio, is I've just finished attending a North American conference of these integrity and ethics commissioners from all jurisdictions across the 50 states and the 10 provinces. But some of them, and this is speaking of Canada, are given the independent authority to make binding decisions. Those are the systems that work generally. Some of them are not. We've got newspaper reports in Alberta. The ethics commissioner in Alberta only has the power to make a report to the legislature, and then the legislature has to decide whether to adopt his recommendations. And the reason we have to have these officials is because politicians have dropped the ball. I'm not referring to the last few years, over decades, and proved themselves incapable of holding fellow politicians to account. So when they pass laws which actually give this authority entirely to these officers, they have the authority to make to do the job and to make their decisions stick. Where they're still beholden to politicians, they can only recommend. That's an incomplete solution. I don't think it's fair to blame the integrity and ethics officers for that. It's fair to blame the politicians for giving them only half the tools they need to do the job.
Don, is that fair to say that you absolutely cannot have a situation where an ethics commissioner is making recommendations, for example, to a premier? He or she has to have the final word on this?
I think it's much preferable that they have that full panoply of powers. And if you kick it back into the political forum, you may get a very unsatisfactory result, Steve.
Has in this whole infrastructure of ethics commissioners and integrity commissioners cropped up because, as Guy just suggested, even opposition politicians, the public doesn't trust any politicians anymore. We don't trust the opposition to keep an eye on the government. We certainly we don't trust the government to keep an eye on the government. Therefore, we need this extra layer of nonpartisan observers who they seem to have more faith in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, that was the first one who was in Ontario in 1988 was recommended by the former Lieutenant Governor John Black-Aird because he perceived that the public didn't trust politicians to keep order in their own house, and we needed somebody who was independent and could take a fresh view and an impartial view, and that system has worked very, very well. And
This
you
is
mentioned
the Aird, who's the former, like the founder of your law firm? Same Aird?
That's right.
Same Aird, okay. Former Lieutenant Governor.
And Stephen Harper's attacks on Bernard Shapiro when he was the first ethics commissioner were very unfair.
And Howard Wilson.
And Howard, well, Howard Wilson wasn't all that independent, but Shapiro was.
Okay.
And I've read all Shapiro's reports. He had some very tough cases to deal with right after he was appointed. And he was, I think, fair and impartial. So it's unfortunate that Mr. Harper made those comments. But
Hang on, I should get his former chief of staff to respond to that. Hang on a second. Guy, go ahead. Your chance to come back on that because...
the system's evolved between Shapiro and Wilson, but the reality is that, and I'll credit Mr. Kretschmer for bringing in officers, but there's been an evolution, and what we have now is a preferable system where we now have an ethics commissioner who's accountable to Parliament, not accountable to the Prime Minister or a minister, or as Mr. Wilson did, had an office in the Prime Minister's office. So, I see Mr. Wilson and Mr. Shapiro as part of a continuum where what we have now with Mrs. Dawson being completely independent, reporting only to the House and Senate, is far preferable to the situation that existed under either Dr. Shapiro or Mr. Wilson.
But Don, all of this, I think all of this infrastructure, it's fair to say, is reactive as opposed to proactive. Is that right? The horse is usually out of the barn by the time the ethics commissioner is involved.
Not always.
Not always?
No, because they can be consulted. So let's say a municipal officer, a mayor, a councillor, for example, in the city of Toronto, is concerned about an ethical matter, wonders what to do, they can consult the ethics commissioner. So there is a preventive aspect to it.
So if you think you've got a problem, you can go to the commissioner and say, here's my situation, am I in trouble? And
Yes.
get some advice?
Yeah, you can get some advice.
And if the advice is you're in trouble,
Well, then you should be guided by the advice. So I'm just responding to your question. Your question was horses out of the barn. Not always. The impression I get from speaking to the people who have served in these positions is it's often been very, very helpful for the politicians to be able to consult them.
okay, but if the mayor of Toronto says, let's be careful here, he's in court again today, it's a reasonable defense to say it's an insignificant amount of money, kids were being helped, I didn't really know what the law was all about, I'm innocent. So how can this work? How can this actually be working if that's the conclusion he has come to?
Well, then you have to go to the other step, which is to employ the Municipal Conflicts of Interest Act and the sanctions that it holds. So that matter is still before the courts. It's under appeal. But if we take a look at the reasons of Justice Hackborn, which seem to me to be quite carefully written, he considered very carefully the entire history of the matter, and he decided that the breach of the rules had been deliberate. That's why he felt that he could not do anything but vacate the mayor's position in the city. So, there's a structure there. There's provisions in the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act that if the action was inadvertent, was in error and so forth, then the ultimate penalty of removal doesn't apply. But according to Justice Hackborn's reasons, he was driven to the conclusion that he reached because the activity was deliberate.
Oh, all right, Tom, go
I would
ahead.
just simply add a couple of things. One is that I would think that there are a lot of people that would conclude that the amount of money involved was not insignificant
In the Ford case,
in the Ford case.
$3,150.
There will be people that will say, for me, that really is a fairly significant amount of money. And I don't really want to comment on further on Mayor Ford, except that I think the public now, as a result of the court judgment, has a basis for examining the circumstances themselves and asking themselves, how is it that one could not know, that one could be ignorant about one's responsibilities in office?
Well, if one doesn't want to know, then one doesn't know.
Well, the question still is, that may be so. That may be the conclusion.
Huh. Guy, how well does legislation aimed at this stuff, like the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, work at preventing breaches?
Well, the legislation isn't designed to prevent breaches. Legislation is designed to set standards and deal with the breaches. It's really a question of education and creating the appropriate culture. I think that avoids the breaches from happening in the first place.
That's the point, right? Because it's all right now. This is all after the fact.
It's exactly all after the fact. The one thing that I think that is it's happening, but we're not there yet, is we've got to get politicians to realize that they are collectively responsible for the opinion in which they're all held. I mean, still, I've dealt with politicians now for 20, 30 years now, and still they bemoan the fact that they're held in low regard, and they'll say, a few bad apples shouldn't spoil the bunch. But the reality is, a few bad apples do spoil the bunch, and it's not just been the bad apples, it's been the collective inability and unwillingness of politicians to exclude, expel from their midst, and discipline those who breach the rules, which has made them all ended up being tarred with the same brush. And
Why won't they do it? Why won't they do it?
Collegiality, you're all one team, and nobody wants to be the one who wants to blow the whistle on his or her colleagues when they're all in the same boat. I mean, partisanship only takes you so far. When it's a partisan issue, one side's quite happy to excoriate the other, but where there is something going on where they're all in the same boat, nobody is going to blow the whistle, and nobody's willing to be the first to say that this sort of expenditure is inappropriate. The best example of this, of course, because there's no accountability, because they're not elected at all, is the Senate, where the Senate is of all the houses. Now we have 15 houses and territorial assemblies at the provincial, territorial, and federal level. They are the least accountable, least transparent of all our representative houses, and that's a problem.
Guy, we're going to have to get you back here when we do the Senate Reform Show. But that's not today's show. Ian, I want to bring you in at this point and ask the problems that we're talking about today. How much of this do you think, as Guy puts it, is a bunch of bad apples? And how much of this is because we have an institutional, systemic problem in this country dealing with these issues?
I think that we have a few bad apples. And I guess amongst the bad apples, I'd say politicians who don't listen to the advice of the Independent Ethics Commissioner. The great majority of elected politicians do very happily listen to the advice because it keeps them out of trouble. Rob Ford is a very unusual person because he didn't listen to the advice, or he wouldn't be in this mess today. But in some cases, we do have ethics rules that aren't strong enough, or regimes that aren't strong enough, and we need more ethics regimes in cities across the country, like the ethics regime we have in Toronto, where we do have an independent ethics commissioner and other accountability officers, and I think that will help. So there is a deficiency there. And some of the regimes that we have are a little bit weak. Federally, for example, we do have an independent ethics commissioner for Parliament and for the federal cabinet, but there's no requirement for cabinet ministers or MPs to meet annually with the people in the ethics commissioner's office so that they can get their education. And that's why we tend to have more breaches of the rules federally than provincially. The other thing is with regard to the Senate. We do have an independent Senate ethics officer who does meet with every senator every year to talk about disclosure statements. And that, I think, has helped the accountability of the Senate a great deal. There are many other issues that they're going to talk about in a future problem, but the issue of understanding the conflict of interest rules isn't as much of an issue in the Senate as in Parliament.
Okay, Don, help us with this. Can best practices and accountability regimes get us most of the way clear of corruption?
I think most of the way. But it would be naive to think that there won't be problems in the future. These things crop up from time to time. Sometimes, now for example, they seem almost to come in waves. So we get back to how effective are the safeguards and the inquiry processes which we have in place. And although this has been referred to again earlier, I would like to refer to it again because it's important. There's a symbiotic relationship between those inquiry processes and the job that the media has to do. We need both in order to make sure we get on top of these things and deal with them when they come, and they will come, Steve.
Tom, I mean, I guess people are interested in the Ford situation for many reasons, but one of which was he was warned many, many times that he was running afoul, and yet he still went ahead anyway and then sort of pleaded ignorance about the whole thing. For those who violate conflict of interest acts, that sounds like an insignificant percentage. In your view, do most of them just simply violate because they think they can get away with it and do so knowingly?
Well, I'm not sure that, well, I was going to say I'm not sure I can generalize. I'm not sure I can particularize either. There is, I think, with those for those who disregard, at least in senior political positions or senior roles in the decision-making process, who disregard the conduct rules, there is an element of feeling that these rules don't apply to me in quite the same way. And I wanted to say that fundamentally, and those who have spoken before me are quite right, ultimately, a culture where integrity in the administration of public affairs is valued as important, and where all of those involved in those decision-making processes understand their role and responsibility, and where integrity holds a prime place. In those circumstances, if that ideal can be achieved, then indeed we will end up with some bad apples, but ultimately public affairs will be administered in the most likely way to avoid these kinds of improper behaviors.
Guy, I've got a little over a minute left here, and I want to give it to you to help us, given how many politicians you've worked with over the years, to help us get inside their heads. How does a politician, knowing what the rules are, knowing what the consequences are, come to a determination that, quote, as Tom just said, these rules don't apply to me? How does that happen?
I don't know. You'd have to ask somebody who's worked for those who are like that. I've been fortunate that I haven't acted for politicians in that situation, but I've seen them, and I mean, they do exist at federal, provincial, municipal levels. I think it comes down in part to arrogance that comes with being elected, and the entitlement philosophy. I mean, these problems don't exist in isolation. You usually have two or three together. So those who tend to think the rules don't apply to them are those who also suffer from the vice of arrogance and who also suffer from the vice of entitlement. It's not one culture we have to fix. It's all of these cultures. But I'm fortunate that neither of the two first ministers I've served fall into that category.
You think neither of them have ever suffered from the vice of arrogance either?
I think that I think that they've done difficult jobs under trying circumstances, but certainly each has had a keen appreciation of the rules and the lines, and it was at great pains to ensure that his conduct was above board at all times.
Gotcha. Guy Giorno, I want to thank you for being there on the line for us from Columbus, Ohio via Skype. It's been good to have your views on the program today. We'll see you again down the road sometime. Ian Green, also professor, School of Public Policy and Administration at York University. Don Jack, partner at Aird and Burles LLP. And Tom Marshall, director of Transparency International Canada. Gentlemen, thanks for your help with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.